we're going to stay in the 20th century. Really, we began today in century 19. Hard for me to realize that we're not still in the 20th century. I sort of lost something back there and realized we're living in century 21. Well, we're going to stay in the 20th century. We're going back to an early part of the 20th century. For there have been sporadic revival movements, some of them of significant proportion in this 20th century. The truth is that some historians would say that at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, the church in much of the world was in a state of revival. And this century actually began in a kind of spiritual awakening. Now, many historians, and this is probably an accurate appraisal, but many historians would take us to the little land of Wales, right off to the west of England. It's a part of the island, but a separate country within itself. I never know what to call it. The British Commonwealth. We called it the British Empire when I was growing up, but it encompasses England, Scotland, and Ireland wouldn't want to be included there, Wales. And Wales has been a land of revival. And in the early part of the 19th century, a revival that impacted the whole world. And that's really not an exaggeration. At least countries on every continent began in that little country off to the west of England called Wales. I suppose it would be correct to say that it began with a young man named Evan Roberts. However, a revival was going on in Wales even before the time of Evan Roberts. In fact, he heard a great revivalist whom God had been using speaking about revival. And that led him to make a prediction that Wales, a country of 2 million people, that Wales was going to see revival soon, in which 100,000 people came to Jesus Christ. Roberts himself was the son of a miner and actually had worked in the mines himself. And in the little Welsh village, sometimes those Welsh towns and cities are terribly hard to pronounce. I think I'm right about this one, in Loghor. In the city of Loghor, where Evan Roberts, a miner's son, was living, the church there was visited by Seth Joshua, a man who had known what real spiritual awakening was. And Evan Roberts, having heard Seth Joshua, went back to his own church, just maybe a young, we would say, ministerial student, and asked his pastor if he could hold a series of services. That's a little bit of an arrogant thing for a young ministerial student to go to a pastor of a sizable church, say, could I preach a revival meeting here in this church? Could I hold a series of services? Well, a reluctant pastor said, well, you can't preach on Sunday, but I will let you preach on Monday and subsequent nights if events so order it. Well, Evan Roberts preached. The Spirit of God ultimately got hold of that meeting. He wound up by preaching his very famous 4-point sermon. Number 1, put away any sin that's unconfessed. 2, put away any doubtful habits. 3, obey the Spirit promptly. 4, confess Christ publicly. It's just very difficult to not so difficult to describe, but maybe to explain what happens. But God just chooses to breathe on certain events in history and causes them to become a kind of spiritual conflagration. And that's precisely what happened in Wales. As Evan Roberts preached in Wales, the Spirit of God moved on those meetings to the point that in time, even the newspapers had picked it up. In a Welsh paper, it says, great crowds of people drawn to Loghor. Wales, by the way, was a country that was accustomed to revivals. It had known what it was to see the entire land bathed in the Spirit of God, and for the entire nation to come under that mysterious spell of spiritual awakening. And so a nation, once again shaken, and a newspaper calling attention to the great crowds of people that were coming to the city of Loghor. In fact, the newspaper said the crowds are staying until very early, 2:30 in the morning. When's the last time you were in a service where the Spirit of God was moving so powerfully that you had to hold the service until 2:30? I've been in some long ones, but never one that lasted till 2:30. But the paper said a remarkable religious revival has begun in Loghor. For some days, a young preacher named Evan Roberts has been used extraordinarily at Moriah Chapel. And the excitement has prevailed to the degree that the crowd simply cannot get in the building. And in time, it virtually ceased to be a service of preaching, and it became a service of testimony intermingled with songs. And it was nothing to stay virtually the entire night in a service where the Spirit of God was powerfully moving. In Wales, in time, every church, virtually every church, Baptist, Congregational, and Methodist particularly, every church was crowded with people. Some of them would have 3 services a day. They'd have an early service in the morning for minors, a service mid-morning for women, and then a service for all people in the evening. And you just, it seems, couldn't satisfy the hunger of the people in Wales for what God was doing in the way of revival in these various churches. Well, that awakening became a catalyst for what I think I announced last night when I said I'm going to talk to you about global awakening, revival that ultimately extended around the world. But a global awakening began in this little country off to the west of England called Wales. And it began through a young preacher. His name was Evan Roberts. Well, people began to come from all over the world to see what was going on in Moriah Chapel and in time in virtually every church in Wales. And when they came, their own hearts would be stirred and warmed, and they would take awakening back with them. And that happened in country after country. Happened in the United States. I may call your attention in a minute to the fact that the pastor of First Baptist Church of Los Angeles came to these meetings. And ultimately, out of that, in time, came the Azusa Street revival, about which I will say more later in this session. But it was the Welsh revival that precipitated a movement that virtually touched, well, not every country, but every continent. And country after country sensed that God is doing something very unusual. And that's the way the 20th century got underway. It really was not an organized kind of thing. It was very spontaneous. I'm not sure that a person who insists on a kind of liturgy for worship would have felt at home in the services. For there might be a testimony, and then somebody would stand and begin singing, and then somebody else would share a testimony, and somebody back in the back of the building had just gotten saved. So somebody stands and says, so-and-so has just come to Jesus Christ. And a rousing applause and a hymn of praise to God would come forth as they celebrated what God was doing in that phenomenal awakening at Wales. Now, what happened? What happened in Wales actually touched the entire nation. And of course, it's not large, and ultimately it moved on over into England. But you might ask, the policeman in Wales, what are you doing these days? You know, there has been no crime, and distilleries have had to close down, and people are doing very little more than just attending services. What are you doing, you policemen, tonight? Well, the men's quartet of the police department is singing in the Methodist Church in services tonight. Several of us will be directing traffic in the Baptist Church as the wagons and an occasional automobile will be coming in. But there was a period of time where there was not one single court of law held in Wales, as the Lord not only effected a spiritual awakening, but a moral resurgence in that land. Now, Wales, as I said, Wales was of such a nature that Welsh people they're acclimated to awakenings. And by the way, they sing like crazy in Wales. I was in Newcastle, Australia, and I'd been preaching all over New South Wales in Australia. And in Newcastle, I heard singing like I never heard in my life in a church. So I asked a man, I said, boy, what's with the singing here? I've never heard anything like it. Oh, he said, most of the people in Newcastle have moved to Australia from Wales. And I understood a little bit about what was going on in the Welsh revival. And out of that awakening, there came such a move of the Spirit of God that hardly a Christian nation, if you please, if a nation where the faith was fairly well known, hardly a country that didn't partake of revival blessing that originated in that very unique work at Wales. Well, as I said, it certainly happened in the United States, and it moved across from California. And I think right now I'd like to talk about what happened out of the Welsh revival in the state of California, in what was called the Azusa Street revival. I don't have notes, before me, but I think my memory will serve me fairly well at this point. But I indicated that the pastor of First Baptist Church of Los Angeles had come to Wales, and he had seen that rather spontaneous kind of work of God that was going on in that small country. So he came back to Los Angeles, and he wanted to reproduce what he had seen in Wales. Well, not everybody in Wales was agreeable, not everybody in Los Angeles was agreeable to that at least not every member of First Baptist Church. And so a new Baptist church actually was begun. And in time, the excitement resulted in something of a breakaway from traditional worship and things that might happen in a fairly traditional church, and what is called the Azusa Street Revival began. They began, this particular group, they began in an old building on Bonnie Bray Street. But the truth is, this particular group was so enthusiastic that in time, the noise they were making and the stomping of feet, or at least similar things to that, resulted virtually in the house collapsing. And so they had to move. And in time, they moved to an old Methodist church on Azusa Street. There, unusual things began to happen. Now, I think that people had spoken in tongues previous to this. But at this particular meeting, people began to speak in tongues. And there was enough that was unusual that was happening that the newspapers picked it up, but usually it was a matter of ridicule what was going on in the Azusa Street revival. And in my opinion, out of that Azusa Street revival, the Pentecostal movement was begun. If you're wondering what I'm looking for, up here I've got an article about Pentecostals that I found to be extremely interesting. By the way, it has led me to think, and I am far from being Pentecostal. If you know me, I think you would agree, particularly as far as doctrine is concerned. Pentecostal doctrine has two unique beliefs. One is the belief that if you're filled or baptized in the Holy Spirit, you will speak in tongues. Now, I think there is a breakaway and by the way, did you know there are 11,000 of these Pentecostal holiness groups? I thought there were a lot of Baptist churches or Baptist denominations. There are over 200. Anybody know for sure we have a church history professor here? I know there are over 200 Baptist groups in this country. And I thought that was a lot until I read that there are 11,000 splinter groups. And today, I don't think, except as it led to the Pentecostal movement, I don't think the most significant thing about the early 20th century was the Welsh revival itself. I think the most significant thing was the birth of the Pentecostal movement. We simply can't ignore what God has done, and I assure you, there is a lot that might go on. Doctrinally, I'm not in agreement, I was telling you. that they believe that filled with the Spirit you speak in tongues. They also believe in a kind of faith healing doctrine with which I can't go along, that it's always God's will for you to be well, that you can never be sick in the will of God, and sickness is always of the devil. Now, those are two particular Pentecostal doctrines that I can never adhere to. There might be others, but you cannot ignore what God has done in Pentecostals today. I hear an article about Pentecostals. It's probably substantially true because it comes right out of church history. By the way, that's one of the finest magazines I've ever taken. And my subscription ran out, honey, some time ago. We might resubscribe to church history. But this comes right out of church history and contends that there are 11,000, I said that, 11,000 different splinter groups of Pentecostalism today. But there are 500 million adherents to some branch, and if there are 11,000, it could be one of many. There are 500 million people who would claim some kind of Pentecostal allegiance today. In fact, recently, well, it couldn't have been too recently because, and I'm not even sure of the date of this particular issue of Christian history, but it's talking about a nationwide magazine, and it was listing the top 100 events of a 1,000-year period, the second millennium, from, I suppose, 10,001 or 11,001 to the year 2001, listing the top 100 events in a 1,000-year period. I don't think there was anything about Baptists, but 68th in that list, and don't belittle that. 68th in that list was the advent of Pentecostalism. And the dictionary of Christianity in this country says that Pentecostalism is perhaps the single most significant development in 20th century Christianity. Now, the person who wrote that is not a Pentecostal. As I said, there might have been a time when we could close our eyes to what is happening in those groups that usually go under the general heading of Pentecostal, and if there are 11,000, I don't believe I'll attempt to name you the few that I know. But nevertheless, the single most significant development in 20th century Christianity. I think that the Pentecostal movement probably can be traced back to the Welsh revival. And there are certainly connections there. But I've said it before in classes and even to some missions professors. I've said that in Latin America particularly, the Pentecostals have put us to shame. In countries like Chile, perhaps even Brazil, they have grown at such a rapid rate that we need to push the accelerator down in countries all across the world as far as missions are concerned. But I bless God. I have a daughter who is with our IMB in Thailand. And I just want to say, Keith, Southern Baptist missionaries are so privileged. No mission organization treats its missionaries anywhere near as generously as does the IMB. And as I said, having a daughter on the mission field, I'm extremely grateful for that. But I have to say that that from the standpoint of church growth in most countries, if there is a Pentecostal church, then they will outstrip virtually every other denomination as far as numerical growth is concerned. But that's a part of how the 20th century in our world began. By the way, I just noticed a little note that I made on the side of that sheet. The largest churches in the world are not Baptist churches or Methodist churches. The largest churches in the world are of a Pentecostal variety. And I look around and see Koreans here. Of course, the largest church in the world, I'm sure, still that church on Yeouido Island in Seoul, of which David Yonggi Cho is the pastor, that at one time approached 1 million in membership. My understanding is they gave a lot of members away, and probably now they're down to 600 or 700,000. That's membership, about which I'm talking. But that's true in Oriental countries. It's true in Latin America. There are churches in Argentina, Pentecostal churches that run 100,000 or have 100,000 people in their fellowship, some 150,000. I say that maybe the most significant occurrence was not so much the Welsh revival in the early part of the 20th century. Maybe it was what happened on Azusa Street, and maybe it was the Pentecostal movement. Whether I am in agreement with much of what might be going on in that movement, nevertheless, I can't be an ostrich and put my head in the sand and ignore what is going on among these people who have called themselves Pentecostal. And